Today on The State of Us, should we pass the Bipartisan Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022? Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by the one and only, the friendly redneck liberal, and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance L. Jackson. Today, we're looking at the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022. It is a mouthful, thankfully, as any good government would do. They've come up with an acronym for us.
All right.
The ECRA. And according to the official document summary of the ECRA, it would reform and modernize the outdated 1887 Electoral Count Act to ensure that electoral votes tallied by Congress accurately reflect each state's public vote for president. And now you're sitting there saying, and why do we care about any of this? Well, if you remember the events of January 6th, and I don't just mean, what was happening outside. I am also talking about what happened inside. Part of the reason the proceedings went on so long is because there were so many objections to electors being submitted, and it raised the question about, is what we're operating under, the 1887 Electoral Count Act, really solid in terms of moving forward, or is it time to update it? And a bipartisan group of senators, both Republicans and Democrats, contend that it is, in fact, time to update it. And so what we have from their official Senate pages is the summary, the one-page summary of this, and we're going to break down sort of the key provisions today. But before we dive in, Lance, do we have a word of the day?
Gerontocracy. 5 syllables. Gerontocracy. Gerontocracy. Government by old men. Is it time to change that?
The last time that the Electoral Count Act was updated, right, 1887. And what does the Electoral Count Act do? Well, it tells Congress, right, and the states the process of certifying who the Electoral College electors are, how to tally their votes, and then how Congress is to handle that process. And you might say, just as a reminder, right, because it doesn't work if Lance and I vote for so-and-so for president, doesn't necessarily mean that our votes are counted one for one, right? We've talked about this before with the Electoral College. Depending on the state that you're in, how many electors your state has, you have more or less relative authority. And most states, like our state of Ohio, are a winner-take-all state, right? So if Lance and I vote for somebody, and you, our listener out there, votes for somebody else, and the person you voted for wins, our votes don't get counted at all toward the grand total, right? Because we lost in the state of Ohio, so we just aren't counted then. That is, the essential nature of how the Electoral College works currently. So when we talk about the Electoral, Count Act, it refers to this process and how all of that is managed. Some of you may be sitting there saying, this sounds kind of confusing. And it is confusing. And that's part of, there's also some gray areas. That's part of why they're suggesting this needs to be reformed. We've done some great episodes on the Electoral College. In fact, we had a whole book. The book itself was called Let the People Pick the President. And it's a great insight into the Electoral College, its benefits, its drawbacks, and what the best thing is for rural and urban America, conservative and liberal America. So we'd highly recommend you listen to that. I'm sure we'll talk about that some in the third segment as we talk about what we think should be done. But let's start breaking it down. The key provisions, Lance, there are a number of them. The first one is a single conclusive slate of electors. It includes a number of important reforms aimed at ensuring that Congress can identify a single conclusive slate of electors from each state. So now you're sitting there saying, well, wait a minute. Are you telling me that Congress might not know who the electors are from each state?
Well, that was the point, right? Because using this law, it was so, it came about after the Reconstruction period in the United States. There isn't a lot of accurate information here, and it had never been an issue. Like most problems in most companies, governments, whatever, it's, we don't try to fix it until we realize it's broken. This is something we should have looked at a long time ago, and that's my main point. And I don't think it's that confusing. What they're trying to do is, if you remember, it's like, well, if anybody complained, one person, you can go off on your own and cause throw a whole monkey wrench in this. And then, as President Trump tried to say with some states, it's like, well, I just want the governor to get rid of that whole slate of electors and do their job and do this. And some of it was true and some of it's not true. The governor can't do that. But what this attempts to do, this entire Reform Act, is to take out all of those issues. And the thing I like about it is it's bipartisan. Okay. And I don't really think it's that hard. It's one of those things to understand. I think it's just one of those things that we're like, well, that wasn't already in there. I mean, it's one of those, when you read it, it's like, well, it's not hard to understand. It's like, I thought that's the way it was already done, but it wasn't. Okay. And because it wasn't done that way, it caused chaos in our country for a couple of months. And so what this is trying to do is not help one side or the other, but just to streamline the process so we don't, because otherwise, now that we know we can throw the government into chaos, who's to say it won't happen in every election? So you need to get it straight now and make a set of rules that both sides agree on so we can have the smooth transition of government that most of us are used to.
Not regardless of whether or not you agree with, what President Trump was trying to do or if his methodology was right, part of, as Lance pointed out, what is raised is there are some holes that were exposed in our system.
Right.
And it's just a question of whether or not we want to clarify those now or whether or not we want to leave them ambiguous and then be open to this sort of thing again in the future. And one of those is this notion of which Lance briefly mentioned, right? That, well, the governor should just, select a new slate of electors or throw out that slate or asking other people in the state, right, who may have jurisdiction over choosing electors to say, well, I know I already chose this elector, but since they didn't vote the way I wanted, now I'm going to unselect them, change it to a different elector that I like, and then send them to Congress. And you might say, well, that doesn't seem like that should be legal. Well, the problem is it's murky, right? It's murky at best as to whether or not you can do that because there's really nothing that says for sure what might happen. So
it may not be legal, but it certainly didn't state that it was illegal.
Right.
And that's the problem. And that's the problem. It's not clear. Is that it's open to interpretation. And what the Electoral Count Reform Act tries to do is get rid of this interpretation so that neither side, this isn't an attack on former President Trump or his government. This is about, we don't want that to happen. And what President Trump exposed was that there are some things that we're not sure of. And so we want to clean this up so that no political party, no president can cause this kind of chaos in the future.
So in order to ensure a single conclusive state of electors, there are basically, three provisions. That first one is, by default, this act will identify the governor of each state as the only person who is certified to submit a slate of electors to Congress. So in other words, if Congress gets something from another state official, like the Secretary of State of Ohio, can't even look at that because it's the governor. Now, what if a state wants to designate somebody other than the governor? Well, they can do that. If the state's constitution, right, or laws say that, we don't want the governor to be the one to do that, we want so-and-so to be able to do that, that's fine. But what this does is it says, by default, right, it's going to be the governor. Now, if you want to change that as a state, you can do that.
Again,
but it has to be the governor unless otherwise directed.
States' rights are big right now for a lot of people. This allows the states to pick, okay? Right. But if the state doesn't pick, it's the governor. Very simple. That's all it is, okay? Your state wants to get in there and say, we're going to let, the clerk at the 7-Eleven down the street pick the slate of electors every 4 years. You can do that. States' rights, okay? But if you don't pick anybody, it defaults to your governor.
The second provision is providing for an expedited judicial review. So basically what this does is it creates a 3-judge panel, and if their decision is appealed, it goes directly to the Supreme Court. Basically, this is only for certain claims that are related to a state's certificate identifying its electors. So in other words, if there's a dispute, right, about is this really the elector that was decided on, or has somebody else been swapped in? And if the court system has to get involved, there is a designated 3-judge panel this is going to go to. And then if, that decision is made and somebody wants to appeal it, it goes directly to the Supreme Court. And there's not, going to be, many months that pass between the first time this is claimed and the first time that some definitive entity can actually make a decision.
Which, if you didn't realize that before, you can't take your case before the Supreme Court generally.
Right.
The Supreme Court decides what cases they want to hear. So when people say, oh, I'm going to take this to the Supreme Court, that's not the way it works.
Right.
But this is allowing for there to be one hearing, and then it can go to the Supreme Court. So as Justin said, so we're not spending multiple weeks dealing with this.
The information from Congress says this accelerated process is available only for aggrieved presidential candidates and allows for challenges made under existing federal law and the U.S. Constitution to be resolved more quickly, right? So let's just avoid the delays. If there are disputes, if there are things that need to be decided, then let's decide them, right, and move on. And the last component of this single conclusive slate of electors, the third component, is modernizing the rules for counting electoral votes. This requires Congress to defer to slates of electors submitted by a state's executive pursuant to the judgments of state or federal courts. So in other words, rather than there being so much ambiguity about, what can Congress say in terms of, is this really the slate of electors or not? It's just kind of reinforcing that first one of saying, if the governor has certified this slate of electors, right, or the state's court has said this is the slate of electors, Congress must accept that as the slate of electors. They can't suddenly say, well, we don't like that slate of electors, so even though you certified it, we're not going to listen to it. They can't do that, is basically the provision here. So there's 3 other provisions to talk about, and then we'll still look at the end of the show about, is this really the best thing to do? Do Lance and I support this? Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. The ECRA, or the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022. Boy, they sure do know how to name things in an appealing way, don't they, Lance?
Of course. That's what gerontocracies do.
Yes. So this act that we're talking about, right, bipartisan in the Senate, and the information that we're reading from is per the official Senate website provided by the co-sponsors of this act, and already has substantive support from both sides. So the next thing we've looked at so far, this notion of a single conclusive slate of electors, right? Making sure that it's not ambiguous who the state is sending to Congress, and making sure that Congress has to abide by who the state sends, and making sure that if there's a dispute, it can be resolved quickly and timely through the courts. All seems to make pretty good sense, right? If this is the system we're sticking with, it seems like those would all be things that we would want to solidify in law and just say, maybe most people aren't going to usually have a problem with this, but let's just make sure, right? Let's just be clear. The next thing, and this is a big one because we've heard, President Trump complained about this specifically. And again, whether or not you agree with the claims, there is some degree of ambiguity. The vice president, Mike Pence at the time, said, I believe that I do not have the power to do anything different than what I'm doing. That's what I believe. And of course, there were lots of legal experts who said the same thing. But the reality is, again, it hadn't been a problem until now, so we hadn't really done anything about it. But then this question is raised of, well, if the vice president is the presiding official for the, counting of these votes, could he maybe simply just choose not to count the votes? Is that an option? And the answer is, well, it's ambiguous. So affirmatively stating that the constitutional role of the vice president as the presiding officer of the joint meeting of Congress is solely ministerial, and that he or she does not have any power to solely determine, accept, reject, or otherwise adjudicate disputes over electors.
So this law says the vice president's role is just a show. Okay. It means they just do it. It's just and again.
Well, it's ministerial. There is a process, right, for the counting of votes.
But you're overseeing the process.
Yeah, you don't have an authority to circumvent the process.
Exactly. Right. And it's just spelling it out. and making that claim, and it applies to Democrats and Republicans, or if we ever get a third, fourth, fifth party, get a coalition government. Oh my goodness. What will that do to people? But be interesting though. No matter what you do, as long as we keep this system, the role of the vice president is just to oversee this and run it through. I like it. Simple, straightforward, easy to understand. Everybody knows the rules.
So the next thing, again, whether or not you think the vice president should be able to do something different, we want to think about, what do you want for all elections? The vice president's always had this role, right, of presiding over the joint session of Congress and counting the, votes. And now the question's raised is, well, if you're presiding, what all authorities do you have? And basically what this does is clean it up and say, here's what you do have the authority to do, and here's what you do not have the authority to do. So that if you end up with somebody other than Mike Pence as vice president, who says, well, I know he felt that way, but I feel this way about it, we have something to point to and to reference.
No
right?
more. Says they do not have any power to determine, accept, reject, or otherwise figure out the disputes over electors. Just, it says straightforward. I like it because it applies to everybody equally across the board. Good to go.
The next thing is this creates a higher objection threshold. So currently, the way it works is only a single member of the House and Senate is needed to object to a slate of electors. And by the way, this is probably what, if you were watching it all, right, that day, this is why it took so freaking long, is because if one person from both agreed, then they had to jointly, right, pause the session, go back to their respective chambers, and then debate this issue, and they did that many times, at the objection of a few people. Well, what this does is it raises the threshold to lodge an objection to electors to at least 1/5 of the duly chosen and sworn members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. So if you get 1/5 of the members from both, then you can object, and now we'll split up and now we'll debate that objection. But if one person from the Senate, one person from the House stands up, now we're not messing with that. Because again, you could say, well, we want integrity and stuff, but yeah, if there's only one person from each house that's objecting to this, not to dismiss it out of hand, but it just drags the process on, because everybody knows, right? They're not going to say anything in debate that's going to change how everybody's going to vote anyway. It just makes the evening go on longer unnecessarily. Why people don't like government, right? Well, the policy says that because these two people objected, we have to now waste, the next 2 hours.
You say, well, but we want to make sure it's done right. So if one person thinks it's wrong, they should have that voice. Well, here's 20%. It's, 1/5, 20%.
It's not it's still not a high threshold.
Still not a tough number to get if people truly think there is something wrong. That's a pretty easy number to get. So again, all the way in favor of this. One person should not hold up the process for any reason like that. 20%, I think, is a very fair number to start with.
So this next one, this may be one of the most interesting. The other ones so far are kind of a very procedural sort of thing, right? Let's just spell out the rules better about how all this works. Because generally speaking, everything that's on here is pretty much the way things happened, right? It was ambiguity, except for this last one that we talked about, higher objection threshold. But even in that case, there were several times where you had, 30, 40 members that stood up and objected. And fine, okay, we're going to have to debate that anyway. That's fine. But with the exception of that, everything else pretty much the way it went. It's more of just saying, let's make sure that there's not a question of this in the future. This next thing, the protection of each state's popular vote. It strikes a provision of an archaic 1845 law that could be used by state legislators to override the popular vote in their states by declaring a failed election, a term that is not defined in the law. Instead, this legislation specifies that a state could move its presidential election day, which otherwise would remain the Tuesday immediately following the first Monday in November every 4 years, only if necessitated by extraordinary and catastrophic events. So again, probably the original intent of the 1845 law, again, you look at history and when it was passed and stuff, was to say, hey, if there's like war going on or something, or some extenuating circumstances on election day where, 80% of people can't get to the polls, we probably want to make sure that we could move election day and let people have a real chance to vote, We want to make sure that states have that ability. Well, that's fine, except because of the way it's written and because it doesn't define the term failed election. It's just if the state legislature feels like it's a failed election, right? Well, it's failed. So we're just going to redo it. I don't think that obviously most of us probably feel like that's a good idea,
Right. We listened to all of the debates. We listened to, all of the candidates. We went to candidate night at the local library or whatever. And we listened and we took our time out of our day and we went and voted. Who are they then to say, well, you know what? This was a failed election. If it was failed long before I placed my vote. And so I think this is power to the people. This is power to the voters. We're not going to let the high muckety-muck gerontocracy of our government take over and control us and say, yeah, you know what? All that homework you did, all that reading, all that listening before you went and voted on the candidates that you wanted to be in office. Yeah, we're just going to arbitrarily say that didn't matter. Your vote doesn't count. I don't think any of us wants the gerontocracy to do that to us.
And ultimately, this protects not just against the gerontocracy, but also that possibility, right, of if there truly are extraordinary and catastrophic events, then something can be done, right? But you're not just going to be able to do that based on a loosely defined term that doesn't have any standards applied to it. Because the whole problem is if you just have a loosely defined term like that, right, failed election, well, what does that mean? Did it fail because you didn't like the result? Did it fail because, the voting place got blown up by a bomb? Why did it fail? Well, it doesn't matter. If we say it failed, and we move it, So again, this one's probably a substantive one. And is it likely that that's going to be a problem? No, it's not likely. But do we really want to not specify what we mean by leaving that alone and not doing something about it? No, I don't think so. I think we want this, I think we all would probably feel I would have a problem, right? If our state was like, well, nah, we're just not going to do that. We're just going to re-vote again and hopefully get better results. And no, now.
And better meaning
the results that we wanted.
That the people in power wanted.
Right. So anyway,
that's not the way this works. That's not the way any of this works.
No.
You don't get to run around and grab your ball and go home because you say everybody else cheated. That's not. Everybody played by the rules. You lost. Grow up, and quit complaining.
And this basically just spells it out, right? It makes it less likely that there's ambiguity that makes it confusing for people, which is part of why people get upset, right? People get upset when they don't understand things.
Well, yeah, President Trump's upset, and he's still been upset because he said, well, I got more votes than I did last time, so why didn't I win? Well, don't be not smart, right? The other person got even more votes. And you know what? The first time you won, you didn't even get the most votes. So just because you got the most votes doesn't have anything to do with whether or not you win the election. To your point.
But that's very upsetting to people because they're confused by that.
Right. But it's.
What do you mean?
But you didn't bother you when you won.
Right.
When you didn't get enough votes. So just because you didn't understand it then and you don't understand it now, don't put the rest of us through the ringer. And that's not an attack on that person. That's an attack on anybody, right?
Yeah. It's just
understand the game, right? Understand the rules of the game before you play the game. And then don't complain about the rules. If you're going to, if you don't like the rules of the game, then change the rules before you play it. But you don't change the rules of the game after you played the game. That's not the way. You don't do it that way. That's just, I don't know who would sit down and play a game and think that was all right. We all agree on the set of rules, and we're going to move forward and play. Well, I lost, so I want to change this rule, this rule, and this rule. You want to change the rules for the next time we play the game? We'll talk about it. We're going to make it simple to your word of the day that you're, using ambiguity. We're going to get rid of this. Great. I think it's fantastic.
I don't think intentionally they wanted a lot of gray area in it, but again, it worked for a time. And every time that we've run into something where it became questionable, well, what did they do? Well, they passed a law, right, in 1845, and then they passed a law in 1887, and then we passed some laws in the 1900s, and now we're going to do it again because it's like, this raises a thing, and we probably want to make sure the law says something about that. So we're going to talk about, is this the best approach? Because we've talked some about the confusing nature of the Electoral College and why it is frustrating and upsetting to some people. So is this the best option? Do this Electoral Reform Recount Act, Electoral Count Reform Act, the ECRA, very memorable name. So is that the best thing? Well, to find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. The Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022, or the ECRA, is working to reform and modernize the outdated 1887 Electoral Count Act. Boy, that's a mouthful. Still the whole show. Very difficult. You know, only a gerontocracy could come up with such a brilliant name for a piece of legislation. That said, it doesn't diminish the importance of the legislation. It is something that's bipartisan, right? Something that has support from senators on both sides of the aisle. And now we come to that fundamental question of, is this the best thing to do? We'll let Lance answer in a second. Do you want to answer first? You want me to answer first?
I don't know. I mean,
what are you feeling?
You want
me to say something and you get upset, or you want to say something and I get upset?
I'll let you get upset today.
Okay.
I mean, the fact that it's bipartisan, we've done a few shows in the last month or so this summer that seem to be, we can use that phrase instead of wishing and hoping for bipartisanship. It's actually taken place, and that's a good thing. To have to call it the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022 makes me lose a little bit of vim and vigor for it. It's like, can't we do this much more simply? But I don't know that we can, and I like the fact that we recognized too late that there was a problem, and now we're trying to fix it. And I guess the only thing that will say whether this is good or not is if for the next 100 years, elections go a lot smoother than this last one did. And if not, I guess we'll be back to the drawing board and saying the outdated Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022, we're now working on it, and it's 2112, and we need to make some improvements on it because we didn't get it right 90 years ago, so I don't know. I hope it works. If you can't tell, the pun of gerontocracy is underlying theme pun of the show is it time, let's get some fresh blood in there. And I'm not talking about Republicans or Democrats. I'm just talking, can we get some fresh ideas and some fresh blood and move the country forward? And this isn't a bash on the floor, but let's make America great again. I mean, we were great. We had racism. We kept down women. We did all these horrible things. I don't want to go back to that. I want some fresh, bright, new ideas. Let's take us to a higher place and a better place. And that's not a crack on President Trump, because the Democrats have, an 80-year-old president right now. I mean, can we get rid of the old males and get some fresh ideas and some fresh direction going? So I don't think this is going to do that, but that's what I want, right? I mean, that's where I am right now. So I'll hang my hat on bipartisanship, and I think it's addressed some of the major issues that we had in the last election. But I'm not holding out a lot of hope that things are going to change fundamentally.
So to answer that kind of question at the beginning of the show, is this the best thing to do? No, I don't think so. Do I want this to get done? Yes, because I don't think the best thing will happen. Okay. So in other words, what Lance has talked about, all of this, it is one of those, the nature of bipartisanship is compromise, right? Is this necessarily the best thing? I don't think so. I'm sure there's lots of people out there who don't think this is the best thing. Is it better than doing nothing? Yes. And we should take it and move forward and make it better. It will be better. Will it be ideal? No. What would be ideal? Well, I think we've done that episode, and that episode is called Let the People Pick the President. And you're saying, so are you saying throw out the Electoral College? Yes, I am saying throw out the Electoral College. Well, I live in one of those states. Well, folks, I live in one of those states, right? It's called Ohio. And, you're concerned, right? Concerned that this is bad for smaller states. And maybe if you're in an even smaller state, let's just say North Dakota, man, this is going to be terrible for us. This would be awful. Tell me how it is better right now. Because I don't know how it's better for people in North Dakota right now. Because if you live in North Dakota, you've been written off. And by the way, you've not just been written off by the Republican Party, you've been written off by the Democratic Party as well, right? Both of them. They don't care because they know that North Dakota and all of its electoral votes are going to be red. So they don't need to come campaign there. Why would a presidential candidate ever visit North Dakota?
So why do they care about what your problems are?
Right. Well, they don't have to.
Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, it doesn't matter to them because they know the way your state's going to go. So they don't even have to give lip service to what the issues are in North Dakota. But if every vote counts, right? And wow, what an American concept. Every vote counts.
And not just counts, but counts equally.
Exactly. Then all of a sudden,
a Democratic vote
we might get rid of, a Democratic vote in North Dakota means as much as a Democratic vote in California. It's 1 for 1. And all of a sudden we can maybe get rid of that phrase that we hear all the time during election season of flyover states. They're campaigning all over the place, but they're not coming to your state. They're not coming within 1,000 miles of you because, as Justin says, your vote really doesn't matter because they know they've either got it or they lost it. And if they're going to get it anyway, well, they don't care what you think. And if they're going to lose it, they don't care what you think. And isn't that what we want, though, from our politicians? Don't we want them to care what we think? Don't we want them to know what, and I know it sounds like that's not impossible, that to know what we want and what we feel? I think that's what we want, though, isn't it? I mean, to Justin's point of what would be best, that would be best. Pay attention to all the voters. Don't write off 2/3 of the states, 2/3 of the voters, because we all already know how it's going to end up. And instead, we're going to pour millions and millions and millions of dollars into these 5 or 6 states that are going to make the difference as to who our new president is. That just doesn't make sense. We want a president of the United States, not a president of the contested states.
And so I think the big thing there, right, is
maybe we get rid of all these old people, right? If we do that. Sorry to interrupt, but I mean,
the gerontocracy is overthrown.
I'm back on that, right? It's like maybe we can get some fresh blood because we're going to change the rules of the game, and you can't do it the way you used to do it. So it's going to take some fresh ideas. It's going to take some new thinking.
And just to be clear, right, this is the only elected office in the United States of America that we do it this way. So it's not like this is some, like crack-a-mania, like, how the heck did you come up with this? This is the most dumb thing I've ever. It's like, well, it's literally what we do for every single office except for president. Yeah, for some reason,
dog
the
catcher,
only thing, right? Yeah, dog catcher is elected this way.
School
county
board,
commissioner, school board, mayor, city council.
Who got the most votes? Well, you won.
Right? Yeah. Who's going to be governor? Well, the person with the most votes. It's like, man, this really not rocket science, But for some reason, we decided that with the president and the vice president, we got to make it really complicated because we wouldn't want it to be easy because then people might know how it's done and then we'd be in trouble.
Right.
And so again, I really do believe, I think that a lot of the resistance to changing it comes from where? It doesn't come from people who are Republicans. It comes from the Republican Party. And that's a very important distinction. Just like the Democratic Party doesn't always do what's best for the people of the party, it does what's best for itself. And what's best for the Democratic and Republican parties is the Electoral College. Conflict, division, forcing people to the extremes, right?
Okay, but
if you blow up all that.
Right. But being a history person, there was many, many decades of nothing but Republican presidents. So it's not that it's just this favors the Republicans or the Democrats. Yeah, it favors whoever has the most people voting for them now. Okay. But
that changes over time.
But to your point, right, and that changes, and it's the ebb and flow of things. And man, maybe we get a new party in here where it blows up those other two. But then all of a sudden, well, if you don't have as many people voting for you, maybe you need to find some new ideas, right? Which would get back to my point of changing things, and it's not like, oh, I want to change it. So we know there's more Democratic voters, so Democrats are going to win, blah, blah, blah. That's not why I want to change it. I want to change it because everybody's votes should count. And maybe if everybody's vote counted, we'd get something else out of this. To Justin's point, it wouldn't be about who controls the purse strings and the power. It's who's going to listen to the people.
In a presidential election, if you live in the state of California right now, your vote, and it's terrible, I hate saying this, it doesn't matter. And if you live in North Dakota and you're a Republican right now, your vote doesn't matter. Now, if you live in Pennsylvania, your vote matters a heck of a lot, Everybody wants your vote. Your vote is very important. And that it just doesn't seem right. It just doesn't
Nothing against the people of Pennsylvania. I like Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I mean,
I've been there often. I love a lot of your food.
But I think the people in North Dakota, Lance, and the people in California should be just as much of an American deciding who the president of the United States is as the people in Pennsylvania.
What a novel concept.
What a novel concept is that we all, Republican, Democrat, anything in between, anything further left or right than that, we all deserve an equal piece of the pie in getting to determine who the president is. And that's not what we do right now. So Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022, it has my support because I think it's better than nothing. And we're for the bipartisanship. Is it the best thing to do? No, there are better options. So why do we have this conversation today, Lance? Was it just to overthrow the gerontocracy, or was there an actual plan here?
No, I mean, the plan is always to try to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we've had one. We've talked about the act. We talked about what was good about it. We talked that, there's a better answer, but if this is the best one we can come up with, then we'll go with it and hope for better in the future. And hopefully you enjoyed that. And if you did, you share it with others and they say, well, that sounds kind of like a neat show. I'd learn something and it's entertaining. And it's like, yeah. Why don't you listen to these guys, You can find them on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and anywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is available Tuesdays and Thursdays. New episodes of the podcast are released first thing in the mornings. Those same episodes are heard as a radio show on the weekends, AM and FM radio across the country. For The State of Us, on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio. Who takes the win today, Lance, on gerontocracy?
I don't know. You threw gerontocracy around a lot at the end there.
Okay, so I'll take the win then. I'll take it. I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson, but it may be under review because you said we used it 3 weeks ago. So.
Okay, maybe under review. We'll leave it up to the ultimate authority. Very special thanks to producer Bradley Butch. Thank you all, our audience. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.